Hi, I'm Tim. Welcome to WatchBox, and thanks for logging on. If you're not watching this on the new WatchBox app, you're doing it all wrong. New features available on the Apple App Store or Google Play. You'll see WatchBox Studios content 1 week early, exclusive on the app. Plus, you can read editorial content from our own Jack Foster and your favorite third-party watch journals, magazines, and blogs. Also, shop our inventory, browse 3,000 pre-owned and vintage luxury watches while also storing your collection, including details of condition, box, and papers. Finally, stay in touch with me, my team, and our entire family of WatchBox client advisors around the world. I'm Tim, and I'll see you on the app. Hi, I'm Tim. Welcome to WatchBox and welcome to WatchBox Hong Kong. I'm here in the world's capital of watch collecting with a collector whose collection has no parallel. I have never featured watches like this in this quantity on the show. You're in for a real treat. John Liu, welcome so much to the show.
Nice to meet you, Tim. Welcome to Hong Kong.
Okay, this is my first time in Hong Kong. I knew to expect a lot. I think you exceeded expectations. But let's start from the beginning of your collecting journey.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the Ovettone.
Okay, the Ovettone was a watch which was, well, my father's actually. It was in the 1950s. I believe this was his first watch which he bought, and it was something he used every day. So he's passed on now, so he's basically handed over the watch to me for my keeping, and I think this will be passed on to my son and to the next generations, hopefully. It's a very special watch because this watch originally, it has a very special dial. It's actually sort of a linen dial, which has actually aged over the years because my father was living in Singapore at the time, and in Singapore there's a lot of sun, so when he was wearing it, because of the sun, it started to age the dial. And it's become now a kind of like a lemon yellow color when it was originally white. So I think to me that's, it's something which is unique in that sense,
And there are two things going on here. First, there's the incredible value it has to from a sentimental standpoint.
Yeah.
But then there's the wonderfully fortuitous transformation of the watch, because through the years a lot of watches age and they look damaged or run down.
Correct.
This, it's almost like it's ripening, it's growing more attractive with time.
Right.
It's somewhere between gold and cream or eggshell on that linen dial.
Exactly, yeah. And these were one of the sort of early sort of bubble back watches, what they called in Italian Ovettone. It's what we call, it's a large bubble back. I mean, there was a trend also at the time for the smaller bubble backs, which I also started collecting. Having had this one, in the early days I started collecting bubble backs as well, actually back in the sort of 2000, in the 90s and 2000.
It's a tremendous watch for the era when a men's size watch could be as small as 32, 33 millimeters.
Yeah.
This is practically a giant by
It's
the
a giant,
standards.
yeah, exactly.
1953 you were saying?
Yes, around 1953. And that's I think about 36 to 37 millimeters, which is big for those days, that's correct.
And it's a very strong watch. You've got the linen dial, you've got the alpha hands, which are so emblematic of 1950s Rolex.
Right.
You've got those wonderful dart-style indices. And then frankly, for a watch that was worn continuously for decades, the metal is remarkably intact. It doesn't look threadbare, worn down, or diminished in any way.
And this is the thing why I mean, aside from the fact that this was passed on to me by my father, this watch can be an example for me that it is 100% original in every way, because it's never been, actually hasn't been serviced yet, to be honest. It should be serviced, and I'm looking for the right person to service it.
This watch means so much that it's worth finding a great vintage specialist. By the way, if you're out there, please reach out to us. And I can't think of a more impressive family heirloom, both because of what it means to you and how it has aged. You've got the alpha hands, you've got the dart style indices, you've got that wonderful bob counterweighted Lancet seconds hand, you've got the linen dial base. You even managed to color match a leather strap to the dial.
Exactly. It actually came with an original bracelet strap, and which I've kept, of course, aside. And it's one of those bracelet ones which can be stretched. It's an early sort of metal stainless steel ones which can be pulled, stretched according to the size of the hand.
The extensible bracelet.
Extensible bracelet one, yeah.
Much loved.
So one thing about my father is that he kept everything, and so this one had the papers, the original papers. It had the chronometer certificate. It had the invoice also where he bought it in Singapore. So it was like the whole package was there. It's just, to me, it was just...
That might be the oldest full set watch I've ever encountered in my career.
Yeah.
1953.
Right.
Even the Rolex coronet itself is different. It's tall,
different.
it's narrow.
Yeah.
It's like looking at it, it's like watching an early episode of The Simpsons where they're drawn different, the voices are different.
Yep. So yeah, I mean, the good thing is that now I have this watch, and I actually from the early days, I went into vintage watches a lot. And as you know, with Rolexes, there are a lot of Frankensteins, a lot of watches have been replaced with parts. So this sets us as a good example of what is original in 100%, and it gives me a guidance to what I collect.
So it's sort of like a Rosetta Stone.
Yeah.
Now this watch is magnificent, but it is by no means alone, as you also have, we're going to turn back the clock a few decades here with Patek Philippe. Tell me the story of this extraordinary piece.
Okay, this Patek, well, in the early days when I first started collecting in the 90s, mid-90s, it wasn't really so much more dealers more than auction houses. I used to go to all the auction houses, and one of the most reputable auction house at that time in the mid-90s was actually Antiquorum. And I spent a lot of time going to their auctions, looking at the watches. And in 2000, early 2000, this watch came up. And for me, collecting watches is all about the dial. The dial is the most important thing, because this is what you see was the first thing. And when I saw the dial, I thought, wow, this is fantastic. To me, I think it's quite unique. I've never seen a dial like that before. And I thought to myself, this is something which I wanted. So I went to the auction and bid for the watch. And when, luckily I was successful, I think it went up maybe from the estimate about 3 times. It wasn't expensive in those days though. I mean, we're talking about maybe sort of 12 to 15,000 US dollars, you know, for a stainless steel watch. But having said that, after the auction, when I picked up the watch, I tried to find a little bit more about the watch. And I understood that the Patek Philippe Museum actually were involved in the bidding of this watch. They were the underbidders for this watch.
You beat the factory.
That was the thing, and I said, how could I beat the factory? It's not possible. They have funds which are, you know, immense compared to what I had, you know, and I was just starting out in my watch collecting years. And luckily I knew the curator of the Patek Philippe Museum at the time, because he worked in Antiquorum a few years before. His name is called Arnaud Tellier. Arnaud Tellier, do you know him? Yes?
I don't know him personally, I know by reputation.
But he started just around 2000 for the Patek Philippe Museum, because at that time Henry Stone wanted to build the museum. So he asked him to join and started to look in the market for special pieces, sort of thing. So I told him, I said, why didn't you overbid me? I mean, you could easily do that. He said, basically the situation is that I'm just starting out. I have a lot of watches I need to bid for. I have a certain budget, and that's okay, that's fine, let you have it, sort of thing.
Proof that you can win against the house in poker.
Could I just add one more thing about this
By all
watch?
means.
And I asked him, but why is it you're interested in this watch, you know? And he told me, aside from the dial being unique, this watch was actually not sold on the market. It was sold internally to a watchmaker in Patek Philippe, who did sort of complicated watches, and he wanted a watch for himself. So he actually bought the movement, which is actually a 1913 movement, and then in 1938 he bought the case from Patek Philippe and the dial, and then cased it himself for his own use. So that was kind of something special. It's not.
What strikes me as the most valuable part of this experience is how many memories and how much history you've already built around this watch.
Yeah.
You know where it came from. You had the experience of outbidding Patek at auction. You learned from the curator of the museum everything that he thought was important about the watch.
Yeah.
You've walked away with a lifetime of stories about this relatively tiny watch, and I think it's important to emphasize with the Ovettone here, comparing traditional sized men's watches like the Patek to the Ovettone, you can see how large this Rolex really is.
Correct, it is.
When this is what a man chose for himself.
Correct. This is only 31 millimeters. Very small watch by those days.
And I can see it's been loved because you fitted it with a modern Patek white gold folding clasp.
I think it deserves that.
I agree.
Yeah.
And super clean dial, by the way.
Yes.
I mean, with the dial that clean, How do you bid with confidence? Because I wouldn't even know where to begin.
I mean, it is a worrying thing, I mean, in a sense. But you know, when I first started, though, it was without too much experience. I went for something which I thought I loved and I liked. And to be honest, whether it was original, I wasn't sure. And I didn't think about it. I just said, I want to wear that watch. That's how it started in the beginning, in my early stages of my collecting.
No, that we've all been there. I think, you know, it's incredible to start with such high sights as you did. And I mean, you never looked back, because rapidly we progressed to watches the likes of which I've never shared. But I have crossed paths with this extra plot Audemars Piguet, because I almost bought this model. Tell me a little bit about that model.
Right. Well, it was thanks to you on your video that I saw it, and then I looked at it and I said, wow, what a fantastic dial. And as I mentioned, my collecting theme is always first look at the dial, and then second, look at the movement. So when I saw this watch, sector dials have always been something which I've been very interested in. It just gives me a feeling of symmetry, uniform, and something special. It's very different from the normal watch. So when I saw this watch, and together with the engraved pink gold movement, I thought this is fantastic. Even though it is very small, it is again similar to this watch, you know, around 31, 32 millimeters.
But a traditional men's watch, also.
A traditional men's watch. It's still wearable though. It's still wearable. And if you look at it by itself, if you take a photograph, you wouldn't tell that this is a very small watch. You know.
Oh no, because the proportions of the pieces in relation to each other, it could be any size.
Yeah, yeah. And AP, I think this reflects AP in the sense that they were famous in the early days for their complications, for their mini repeaters, perpetual calendars, chronographs, and extra thin watches. This was an extra thin watch. An extra thin watch is considered a complication in that sense. You know, it's very difficult to make. So.
Without a doubt, I know that this base movement, the 2000, used a JLC, I believe it was the 802 Bausch. It was created for AP and Vacheron in the 50s. And the movement itself is only 1.65 millimeters thick.
Yeah.
So when those go back for service, like you said, the person who services that movement is the guy who does the super sonnerie. It's the guy who does minute repeaters. It's the guy who's super high level, because to touch it without knowing is to break it.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
So it's not just a wonderful watch, it's a very historically important movement in a wonderful watch.
Exactly, exactly.
Okay, now this is where things go way beyond my experiences. I've never experienced a dress watch from this brand, from this era. Tell me the story of this Breguet.
I've always loved Breguet watches. Again, coming back to the dial, I love guilloche dials, you know, and especially with hand guilloche. And they have a certain feeling of classicism, quiet elegance, and that's what I liked in this watch. And I was always looking for a Breguet. This one came to me through a dealer. When I saw it, I wanted it because it was quite a unique kind of watch, because this watch actually has, it's actually not stainless steel, it's white gold with pink gold combination. It's extremely rare to have one of that type for a Breguet watch which was made in the 1950s. So we're talking about the early Breguet watches, prior to Chaumet, prior to Danny Roth. This is what they made, and they made them in very few examples because it wasn't very popular, to be honest. At that time in the 50s, they were making more of the chronograph, the XX chronograph watches. So there were more of those than these. And these were really sold to people who was interested to have a, you know, a classic watch to wear for evening and so on.
It's amazingly substantial for a dress watch from that period.
Yeah.
Again, like the Ovettone, it's much larger than would have been standard, and it's got a lot of wrist presence with the unusual two-tone treatment.
Correct, correct. And it's large because the size of the watch is actually only 35 millimeter, but because the lugs are quite long, so it gives you a feeling when you wear it that it is quite a large watch, you know, because of the lugs, the length of the lugs.
And the dial, I mean, the dial is the heart and soul, as you say, and with so many Breguet watches, that means an incredibly distinctive, classically inspired watch face, really a pocket watch for the wrist.
Correct, correct. Now, what is it more interesting about this watch is that this has a very special movement. The movement, the name of the movement is called the Perso 260. The Perso 260 was a movement which was actually not made for serial productions. It was actually made for the brands, to be put into sort of competitions for observatory trials, for accuracy. So I believe they made about 3,000 something movements, 3,300, over a period from mid-40s to the 1960s. And those were never put onto the market for sale. They were always sold to the different brands so that they could use it to compete in the trials for accuracy.
And that sort of was the golden era of the chronometry trials, the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s.
Yep.
And companies like Peso and Zenith, Jaeger-LeCoultre and others did build movements that almost seemed to be fitted to watches as an afterthought. They were designed for competition.
Right.
And decades later, artisans like, for example, Kari Voutilainen would
Correct.
take that Peso
Exactly.
260, recase it, and give it new life for a new generation of collectors.
Yes, that's right. Kari actually, I think about 10 years ago, he managed to find a few of these Peugeot 260 movements and said, okay, this is something which I want to build into my watch and then put it as a small series. And I think it was called the Observatoire, right? Observatoire. So those are very special watches, and Kari is a very, very fantastic watchmaker, and he brings a lot of classicism into the modern era, which I like a lot.
He also has the comfort to work with something from the heritage of watchmaking. It doesn't have to be all in-house. It doesn't have to be 100% his. He's comfortable embracing the grand history of the industry,
Yep.
and then sort of writing his coda to the verse, so to speak.
Right. Exactly. So from there, moving on, I think rather than moving on to this one, let's have a look at this Urban Jürgensen.
By all means.
Because we're talking about Kari, and we're talking about Guilloche dials. So it's very much linked to Breguet, in the sense that the inspirations from Urban Jürgensen, I think, is from Breguet originally. The original, the company itself is a very old company. I think it was a Danish company established in the 19th century. But I think they didn't carry on until the 1970s. It was sold to a gentleman called Peter Baumberger.
Yes.
Peter Baumberger, and he took over the company in the early 80s. He said he found that the history was very good. He wanted to build a wristwatch from that. So he started actually working together with Derek Pratt, who is a fantastic watchmaker who is actually very underrated. He's actually in the same sort of levels of George Daniels, but was never sort of publicized too much. He started out with this wristwatch, which is the reference 2. This is the first wristwatch, which is a perpetual calendar, size of about 37 millimeters. It's a very wearable size, but you can see it's so beautiful. It's like it's very similar to the Laurent Ferrier. If you look at the pebble stone sort of feel about
the
it,
Gallet type.
the Gallet type. It's very smooth. It's very elegant and thin, sort of thing, and it has a very quiet elegance about it. But the most important thing is that the layout of the dial for a perpetual calendar is fantastically simple. It's so easy to read, and it doesn't seem to cluster all the sort of
And without
information.
a doubt, it has a lovely sort of cruciform symmetry. You can cut it bilaterally, or you can cut it vertically, and there's symmetry.
Right.
The wonderful thing about Urban Jürgensen in the modern era under Peter Baumberger and later Dr. Helmut Krott was the willingness to engage truly impressive independent watchmakers. Like you said, with Derek Pratt, his magnum opus for his entire career might be the oval tourbillon pocket watch that he built for Urban Jürgensen.
Right.
He loved it enough to put it on his business card, so he thought that was his career statement.
Yes.
And later on, Kari Voutilainen would be brought in.
He was involved, he got involved, I think, in the mid-1990s, when Peter Baumberger actually saw one of his, I understood that he saw one of his personal work of a watch, a complicated pocket watch, and he wanted to buy it from him or something, if I recall. And Kari said, no, I'm not quite ready to sell it, but eventually they got together, and I think Kari helped Peter Baumberger to develop some of the watches and work with some of the watches in the sort of early 2000s.
And Derek Pratt, if you haven't read up on Derek Pratt, everyone knows George Daniels, but I know from people who knew both of them that Derek Pratt was at least on par with George Daniels.
Yes, definitely, most definitely.
This is a magnificent piece, and what's fascinating to me is that there's not much awareness of the modern Urban Jürgensen brand. There's not much of what they did historically as a Danish-based brand, but the modern-day pocket watches and wristwatches, you could have a watch collecting epic built solely on those references.
Correct, yeah.
Now this one I think we should probably talk about, because if there's one feature of your watches that I noticed from piece to piece, it's a sort of organic elegance, and this might be the epitome of that.
Yeah, I think so. This is wonderful, and this is a recent acquisition. Again, thanks to you, Tim, when you put out the video and I saw the watch. But in fact, actually 2 years ago, this watch actually came out in 2019. I did see it in a magazine, in I think one of the Revolution magazines, and I looked at the shape and the design. I thought, this is beautiful. It's a beautiful watch which I would like to own, and never got around to it until I managed to see your video and say, oh, that's available. And I said, okay, this is something I would love to have. It's not just the form, the shape form, the rectangular form, but it's also the movement. It's fantastic. The movement is of a standard which is equivalent, I think, to the best, I would say equivalent to Patek Philippe, to Lange. There's no worse movement than that, I think.
I would argue that you're absolutely on point. I think that Laurent Ferrier does not get enough credit because it isn't a tablisseur. There is sort of a tendency to disregard a company that assembles high-grade pieces rather than make it all in-house.
Yeah.
But let's be honest, for 250 years, that's what Vacheron was.
Correct.
And
Correct.
So this is in that Geneva tradition, that of Vacheron Constantin, and for much of its history, Patek Philippe as well. You've got a movement that is, if not on par with the likes of the Romain Gaultiers of the world, very, very close. The black polished click spring over the barrel on this movement is beyond belief. And then you've got a case inspired by the Passerelle de Lille Bridge.
That's right, yes.
That Ferrier himself would frequent as a citizen of Geneva. But whereas that bridge is sort of like iron aesthetic, this is almost, again, organic. The sides inflect downward, inward.
Right.
There's a compound curvature of the case band that almost looks like something that would have come from modernist art. It looks like high Art Deco, ocean liner Art Deco. And then that's before you even get to the enamel dial. Right,
exactly. Actually, the interesting thing about this design of this watch is, whilst you mentioned about the bridge, I hear stories that basically this watch was designed based on his love, Laurent Ferrier's love for motor vehicles, for driving, because he's a racing driver.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so if you look at the shape of it, it's like a very sort of like design with 4 wheels. So the lugs coming out at the end will be considered 4 wheels. It's like a supercar in a sense, if you know what I mean.
With the wheels pushed right out to the edges.
And that was his initial design, actually.
So it's both it's both the bridge and the vehicle.
The bridge is the marketing side. The personal idea is that he loved it because of cars, I think.
And that's why I think people underrate Laurent Ferrier, because they see, they're not a manufacturer, so it's not their ideas, or it's not the spirit of their own, inventive genius. It must be something that's imported from suppliers. No, the design is very much Ferrier's.
Yeah.
Him and his son Christian, they oversee that brand. They are the creative force. If a supplier's brought in, it's brought in to execute their vision, not the other way around.
Right. Exactly. So I love form watches. I know it's not as popular as round watches, but I think they should have a comeback. I think they give a different angle to wearing a wristwatch. And like today's market, there are a lot of formed watches like Lange & Hein. I love Lange & Hein, and it's something which I'm actually looking to acquire as one of my grail watches, I think, one day. They have a model called the Jürg, which is, if you look at the movement, I think you've seen the movement, it's fantastic.
Yes, very much.
It's a very beautiful movement,
But that's why there's so many great options. People say, I'm burned out on AP, Patek, and Rolex. There's nothing left. There is so much left.
So much in the market, yes,
Even
exactly.
just looking at non-round watches, it's not just Cartier and JLC.
Right.
There are models like the Lange Georg. There's the Bridge 1. There's the Dignitas from Aaron Bechet. You have so many different choices.
Exactly.
It's a wonderful piece. Now, we're getting into uncharted territory here with pocket watches.
Correct. And
this is going to have to be the grand finale. I'm sorry, but
so
making an executive decision, that has to be the last thing we show.
Yeah. So in my collecting years, basically, I started having an interest in Patek Philippe watches in the mid 1990s to 2000. But during that time, there was a lot of interest in pocket watches, because actually in the 1990s, if you look at the auctions, the main interest, the main collectors were mainly looking at acquiring pocket watches and automatons. So these were the connoisseurs who were looking for that kind of watches. Wristwatches were not that popular at the time, and they were considered as a second sort of level sort of thing to collect. So I started try to understand more about pocket watches, and what interested me was these Chinese market pocket watches, or pocket watches made for the Chinese market, because this is something which my forefathers, my generation before, would have collected, because they were made in Switzerland. They were built in Switzerland and in England, in London, and they were sent to China to be sold to the Chinese. In fact, who started it very early was a gentleman called Matteo Ricci in the 1650s, where he was a Jesuit priest, and he wanted to go to actually convert Christianity to China in the 1650s. So what he did was to convert them. He had to bring some special pieces to attract them to be interested to listen to him. So he brought things like automatons and clocks, which were engraved and enameled and so on, and things like little sort of singing bird boxes and so on, which interested them, so that they allowed them to attend, for him to have a chance to talk to them. So it all started from the 1650s, where the China market was how would you say, it's introduced to these Chinese market pocket watches. And then I think it thrived more towards the 18th and 19th century, where there was a huge market from the Swiss and from the British to export these to China for their collectability. If you look at the work here, it's a painting on enamel, done just like in a painting in a picture. And this is not easy to do. It's a polychrome enamel, and as you know, with painting on enamel, it requires a very delicate, very special process where you have to sort of heat up different layers depending on the colors over some time. So it's very easy to make a mistake on something like this.
And on these watches, there's miniature painting, enameling, engraving,
Engraving,
gilding.
exactly.
The Chinese market at the time wanted the most elaborate watches available.
Correct.
Not just one refinement, everything all at once.
Everything all at once, which also includes the movement. They wanted the movement to be engraved, and
every single surface is blued screws.
blue screwed, yeah, exactly.
Full engraved brass, every single surface, every single component
Yes.
has been dual purpose, basically.
That's right.
This is as much about the art as it is about telling time.
It is, yes.
Now each one of these gets successively more spectacular.
This one is another Chinese, a pocket watch made for the Chinese market. It is a more, I would say, less costly than this one, because this was actually made by William Ilbery. He's a very famous London sort of watchmaker, and their watches tend to be made of gold and of a higher level. This one is a silver gilt pocket watch. But what I wanted to show you with this one is that it's very interesting that how do we know that this was again made for the Chinese market, for the Chinese market. If you look at the painting polychrome enamel, it's a picture of a photo of a lady, a Spanish lady with a fan. But if you look carefully at the fan, you will see 888888888. Now we all know for the Chinese, basically 8 is a very sort of a good number for us. So this is something which is, I think, proves that this was definitely made for the Chinese market, in particular.
As we know from every Roger Dubuis limited edition ever made.
Yeah, that's right.
And so it's a very impressive watch, partially because the work is so impressive. It's one thing to be able to paint in miniature.
Mm-hmm.
It's another thing to be able to execute it in enamel. I could not paint something the size of a sand dollar to look like it has the resolution and the detail
Correct.
and the clarity of a meter tall painting.
Mm-hmm.
This has that level of resolution.
That's right.
So outwardly, this is probably the least ornate of the watches that you've brought.
Mm-hmm.
But as Mies van der Rohe often says, God is in the details, and the details are inside the watch.
That's right. This is a brand called Louis Audemars. It's a brand which was actually making high complications, minute repeaters, perpetual calendars, and it was a brand which was actually very well known in the 19th century. They actually only made, in total, in their life of 75 years, they only made 9,000 pieces. So that's what I call limited. 75 years, 9,000 pieces. This watch is quite unique in the sense that it also belonged to someone who is actually very well known in Hong Kong and has a historical background for Hong Kong. It was owned by a gentleman called Mr. Belalius, and he was actually of Jewish descent, from Calcutta, and he came over to Hong Kong in the sort of 19th century, early 19th century, to trade, because everybody came to Hong Kong, to the Canton of China, to start trading and build up the business. So he established himself to be well known, and in fact, he was one of the sort of early chairmen of the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, and wanted to, how would you say, build up the sort of flourish the business in Hong Kong for his future. The other interesting thing about his background, I read, is also he had a house on mid-levels, which is in the sort of middle of the mountain. But in those days, you don't have a very good sort of access to the mid-levels. So he used to have a camel, which would carry him all the way up to his house every day and down to the office.
But incredibly, I believe there's a portrayal of the man himself in the watch.
Yes, there is. So if we turn to the back, let's have a look.
Yeah, it's fascinating because some of the other images here are, for purely aesthetic purposes. This is literally the identity of the owner inside the watch.
Correct. This is the identity of the owner, and again, the workmanship is fantastic. This is a painting, polychrome enamel, painting on enamel. And if you look at it, it is very, very naturalistic and very, very original. And very detailed, extremely detailed.
I mean, it's as close as you could get to a photograph without being a color photograph.
Correct, and yes, exactly.
There's also incredible banknote scrolling framing his portrait.
That's right, exactly, yes.
But where things get really crazy...
Interesting is the movement.
Yeah, so if you've seen the JLC Dualmet, this is like its great-great-great-grandfather. And to be perfectly honest, the dual barrel, dual ratchet, dual train thing, where you've simultaneously got a quarter repeater, a deadbeat second, a perpetual calendar, and a moon face, this is where that started. And I would not be shocked if this is a Victorin Piguet Bausch.
Right.
But this is the height of mechanical complexity among the three pocket watches you've bought. And you could see how gun shy I get with these things. I don't even want to try to open the case if I'm not familiar with the watch. And that's exactly how you should proceed when what's inside the case is this impressive. Mm-hmm. Where did you find this watch?
This was from a reputable dealer from London. He has actually, over the years, always come to Hong Kong. He has a certain number of collectors, and this was a watch which he brought over one day. I think it was about 20 years ago, a long time ago. And I just thought this was something very special, and it was actually something very meaningful for Hong Kong, because actually this person actually carried this watch in Hong Kong because it was specially made for him by Louis Audemars, and he used it for a certain period in Hong Kong. So there has a historical fact for Hong Kong, I think, in that sense.
It also has an immense amount of mass compared to the other two.
Correct. Yeah.
What a machine. Well, we're going to return to this because I can't think of any crowning glory to end this interview beyond what you have in here. This is something I've never seen in my life, and you may never see it again. But let's talk about some of your tastes in modern wristwatches, because we've explored a lot of vintage, and other than the Ferrier, most have been several decades in arrears. This Lange 1 time zone is probably the most thoroughly progressive, forward-looking, and modern watch in your collection. It's certainly your largest wristwatch.
It is a big watch, 41.9 millimeter, but surprisingly very wearable. In fact, I brought this watch because it was actually I would say it's the first watch which I bought for Lange, and it was only acquired about 3 years ago, just around the pandemic time. I've known about Lange & Söhne for many years, having collected, but in my early days, I used to collect, I think I concentrated more on Patek Philippe and automatons and Chinese market pocket watches. But I've always heard about Lange, and I knew it was very good at the time. But it just, during that pandemic period, I started to try to find out a little bit more about the watch, the brand. And luckily, this was sort of a watch which was from WatchBox. And I saw it, and I wanted it because it was, if you look at the simplicity of the dial, I mean, there's so much going on in there, but it's so simple to read. So you have 2 time zones, you have the big date, and everything is at the day and night for both the present time zone and also in the second time zone. So this is just such simplicity in the Lange 1 dials,
And on top of everything else, the dial is a disc of sterling silver.
Correct, yeah.
You've got gold without, you've got silver within, and you've got a watch that's somewhat, I would say it's sort of a splicing of a world time watch and a dual time watch.
Correct.
It's a fairly unique complication.
Unique complication, yeah, that's right. And again, because of what I like in terms of collecting, I like to collect, coming from a background that I'm a naval architect actually by background. I love engineering and I love design. And if you look at the mechanics of the Lange watches, it's second to none really, in the sense that you can't compare it to any other brand. It's fantastic. It's super.
The bridges and wheels for the secondary time system, here they're drawn directly from the design language of vintage Saxon pocket watches.
Correct, exactly.
And then, of course, you stepped up with the deploying clasp. That's not always present on Lange watches.
Right.
You've gone for a punchy combination of a black dial and a rose gold case, and that's not really the aesthetic of the remainder of your collection.
Right.
With one notable except, by the way, if you want to set one of these, check my video, because just as I would not open one of these pocket watches without knowing it well, you should not attempt to set this watch without knowing how to set it, because it feels like you're going to break a time frame when you set it.
Right.
But again, dark dial, gold case, smaller profile, but arguably more complication. This might be the most underrated watch of the modern era.
I think so, yeah.
Tell me, please, about the PanoRetroGraph and how you discovered this.
Well, it's because, as I said, when I started looking into German brands, German watchmaking, and I think Lange is definitely the top tier there. But a lot of people have not looked at the other brands which have been around also for similar time, especially Glashütte original. And if you look at this particular watch is very special because it's actually highly complicated. And when you compare it to a Lange 1, this is quite similar to a Lange 1 kind of design in terms of the dial. And what I would say is that this watch has a special mechanism which basically, aside from the usual of having a flyback chronograph, it also has a counter sort of a clockwise sort of chronograph, which has a chiming. So you can time yourself. For example, if you want to boil an egg or something, you put it to 3 minutes or 2 minutes, and it will chime on the 3rd minute, like a minute repeater, like a gong, with the gongs.
And it really is a peerless watch, very wearable in 39 millimeters. When this came out around the turn of the century from Glashütte Original, it was part of an offensive to rebuild the name of the company as a luxury watchmaker. It kicked around through many different ownerships in the 1990s. Lange itself was restarted using a name that legally would have belonged to Glashütte Original itself.
That's right.
And there was this attempt to get away from its history as the communist era purveyor of cheap, utilitarian watches. And between the PanoRetroGraph and the Julius Osmond series, they really made a statement of what they were capable of still doing at the company that had just recently been the communist GUB, and it became Glashütte Original. And with the PanoRetroGraph, we had a flyback, programmable countdown timer with column wheel. Correct. All with a bespoke movement built just for this model.
That's right.
All of these things at once, and while it should be recognized like the Datejust, it gets forgotten.
And it's very interesting because it came out 1 year after the Datejust came out. I think the Datejust came in 1999. This was introduced in 2000, and it's like, I think it's equivalent in terms of, if you look at the movement, it's like there's no worse than a Datejust movement, if not even better, I would say.
The level of intricacy is definitely higher. And again, when you have programmable countdown chiming flyback chronos, you'd ask, well, who did this? Oh, maybe Grubel Forsey, maybe Richard Mille, Audemars Piguet, Renoir Papy. No, it was being done in East Germany as we exited the 1990s. This is a very special piece.
Yeah.
We also have a watch that, we can say whatever we want to say about whether the current Lange Söhne is the legal successor to a Lange Söhne, but de facto, if not de jure, this is the successor. And this watch was an homage to one of the men who made it possible.
Correct. This watch was a homage to Walter Lange, who passed away in, I think, 2017, roughly about that time. It has an interesting story because, and that is what brings an interest to own a watch, because this watch is basically a summary of the reflection of the history of how Lange Söhne started, basically. Walter Lange always wanted to have this particular movement. It was a patent for a jumping second hand, which is stoppable. So you can say it's a pre-chronograph, very early chronograph kind of movement. And he always wanted to, and this was patented, I think, by his great-grandfather, Adolf Lange. And he always wanted to have this movement to be made for the series, for the Lange sort of production, current production. And from my understanding, again, I understand that Tony de Haas and Tino Boba, the directors in Lange Söhne, they mentioned that every year since 2000, I think in the mid-2000s, he used to come over to their office and say, any chance to make this movement, you know, for the Lange series? And every year they said, no, it's not possible because it's not commercially viable. Nobody wants to have a movement of this type, you know. And especially when they came out with the Richard Lange jumping second, Walter came back and said, is this the one which is from my patent from my family? And they said, sorry, it's not. So he was very, very upset actually, in the sense that he never got what he wanted, simply because this was a movement which was very expensive to make, but not very practical, in the sense that you can't use it like a chronograph, you know.
What's fascinating here is because, you know, it is a group brand. We don't often talk about Lange as being, you know, the kind of brand that has the same spirit and innovation and energy as the independents, when we really should. Because the people who've been associated with the brand, like Walter Lange, like Tony de Haas, like Günter Blumlein, these are some of the most important figures in the modern annals of the watch industry.
Yeah.
And I know if Tony de Haas decided tomorrow that he was going to go solo and put his name on the dial of a watch, it would be sold out for 3 years.
Right.
And when you're buying a Lange, you're getting his collected works spanning more than a decade.
That's right.
And that's really why Lange, even though it is a group brand, still has the sensibility and the initiative and the invention of an indie.
Yeah, exactly. So this was a very special movement made in memory of him after his passing in 2018, and they made a very limited number of these. I think the total number was 260 something movements, and that's it, because this was actually a homage for him. It was a tribute to him. And so when we talk about rarity, I would say this chronograph movement is more rare than any of the other movements in terms of like the Datejust, the 951.1, 951.2.
Oh, without a doubt.
There's only 260 and nothing more will be made. That's it. It's purely for his to tribute to him.
The bridge underpinning that mechanism is absolutely bewitching, and I'm dying over that ratchet wheel with the triple solarization.
Right.
That is a blazingly beautiful case back on a deceptively simple dial.
A very simple dial. Something again. What I love about this watch is also the jumping second, because it brings the watch alive somehow. If you look at a small second hand, you sometimes feel like it's stopping, or you have the impression that it's not moving. But with a jumping second, you know that this watch is alive and it's moving and it's working. That's how I feel about it. So I love the watch because of the jumping second hand.
So we're not quite done yet, and I want to save this for last,
Right.
but I've seen your progression as a collector, and I'm curious, because we all have ambitions, what watches intrigue you for the future? What are you looking for? What's on your horizon? Do you have a Grail watch?
Grail, I mean, as a collector, I'm always looking for something interesting, but I mean, as I said, in the recent years, I've been moving towards German watchmaking, so I'm very interested in watches made from Germany. And Lange is definitely one of my grails of brands. I would like to have a Zeitwerk, which I don't have at the moment. They are rather large watches, spanning from 42 to 44 to 45 millimeters.
Without a doubt, they're chunky.
I would love to have the decimal striking Zeitwerk, which is extremely interesting because it has a chime, but it is 45 millimeters. So I'm waiting for them to do maybe a smaller one if possible one day.
And we spoke earlier about Lange und Teine. They make beautiful watches.
They make absolutely beautiful watches. It's also another independent small brand. And what I like about independent brands is that they're very personal. You get to see the watchmakers. You have a chance to talk to the design of the watches. And with Lange and Heine, it's very interesting because actually the design director, the director of the company, one of the directors, is called Jens Schneider. He was actually working in Lange Söhne for many, many years, and he was actually the patent for Zeitwerk was under his name actually.
Actually, he was also technical director at Moritz Grossmann, which is another
correct,
fantastic
exactly.
German brand.
Yes, exactly. So it's a little brand, but people are very quiet, but they will spend a lot of time to talk to you, And this is what we're looking for as a collector, you know. It's the one-to-one sort of discussion, which I appreciate, you know, rather than just buying a watch for the sake of buying a watch sort of thing, you know.
Oh, I understand.
It's the experience of discussing and talking and enjoying that moment and making friends, you know. I think that's what it's about.
And if you don't make friends, you don't meet people, you don't go places and see things,
Yeah.
that's really just like online shopping. You
Yes,
lose all the
exactly,
meaning.
exactly. Absolutely.
Of course, watch collectors and collectors of anachronistic mechanical baubles have been at it for a long time, and this would have been created to serve our predecessors in the horological fraternity, though it's not a watch, strictly speaking.
It's not a watch, but the mechanism is really similar to a watch in a sense, you know.
Oh my
It has
goodness.
a fusee and chain sort of movement, and I need to wind it a couple of times. All right. All right, I'll start playing it now. If you notice the bird, it's so realistic. He's moving his head, his beak is opening up and down, his tail is flapping,
The
his wings are
flapping?
flapping, everything is moving. It's an automaton.
100% of that is powered by springs and gears and cogs
Correct,
and wheels.
correct.
And it's beautifully crafted externally. This would be a work of art by itself if
Yes.
it were just a business card holder.
Right.
What is the history of this device?
It's made by Frère Rochard in sort of the sort of early 19th century, around 1800 something. And these were produced again for wealthy people. I think it's basically a toy, you know. But what they call them was actually not, rather than singing bird box, they call them tabatière. Tabatière means actually a snuff box. So a lot of them were used because they're quite small size. They have a little sort of opening at the back, where they can put their snuff, and they can carry this around with them and show off to their, you know, other colleagues and friends.
Wow, more than one way to get high.
Exactly. And if you look at it, this is a tortoiseshell box, but again, painting on enamel, Genevan painting on enamel. And if you look at it, it is very naturalistic. It's a scene of Geneva.
And if you were to get a Patek Philippe dial like this, like a 5089 custom, it would cost a fortune just for the dial.
Correct.
This is the
Yeah.
box.
Yeah.
It's the enamel. It's the miniature painting.
Mhm.
It's the clockwork.
Yeah.
It's the automaton.
Right.
It's the sound box. It's all of these things.
Mhm.
And it's really, I would say, about half the size of an iPhone. It's incredibly
Exactly.
compact.
It's incredibly compact, that's right.
John, this has been an absolute blast. We've exhausted the superlatives. Please, just tell me we'll do this again.
We can do that. It's
Thank
a
you
pleasure
so
to.
much.
Thank you very much, Tim. Thank you.